As the director of the John Adams Institute, I'm very proud to welcome John Irving, our author for the evening, to The Hague. I would like to compliment you with the mid-price edition of your book, Until I Find You, published in Dutch under the title Tot ik jou vind. The John Adams Institute is very honored to have you as a speaker at the Institute for the 4th time, which is really unique since we usually have speakers just once. Thank you for coming again. Mr. Irving's 800 pages book is a very well-selling title, and it should interest the Dutch because he's unveiling the Amsterdam tattoo scene and had many conversations with the famous Dutch tattoo artist Mr. Henky Panky. I've read that you got 2 tattoos during your research period for this book, and I wonder what designs you choose. Mr. Irving is one of the most popular writers in the world. There are millions of copies in print of his books. His breakthrough was in 1978 with The World According to Garp. Other successful books are The Cider House Rules, A Prayer for Owen Meany, and A Widow for 1 Year. Most of his books have been adapted to screenplay and made into highly popular movies. It is an enormous achievement to be that successful over and over again, Mr. Irving, and maybe we can learn from you some tricks of the trade tonight. Your book has been dedicated to your youngest son, and you wish him an ideal youth. And you write that his youth is so different from the one described in your book. And I suppose it's not your family life, but your imagination which makes your books so entertaining and inspiring. Tonight's moderator is Hans Bouman, literary correspondent for the Volkskrant. Hans Bouman will introduce John Irving, and after the lecture of Mr. Irving, he will start the conversation. Mr. Bouman will discuss not only the book, Until I Find You, but also the career of Mr. Irving. Questions from the audience are taken after the conversation. I will be back later this evening with information about our upcoming lectures, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's lecture. Hans, maybe you can...
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a long time since I read The World According to Garp, but despite my rather bad memory for novel plots, there are many scenes in this book that I remember quite vividly. One of them relates the conception of the protagonist of the book. The mortally wounded Technical Sergeant Garp, gunner of the US Air Force, lies in a Boston hospital. Before he dies, Nurse Jenny Fields uses the sergeant's one still very vital organ to impregnate herself. Garp dies the next day, but he will live on through his son, the hero of the novel. Garp Jr. henceforth grows up a semi-orphan, and as a matter of fact, his biological father himself is also referred to in the book as an orphan. This orphanesque background probably explains, at least partly, why Garp later on becomes such a vivid family man, as I believe his literary father is as well. As we all know, and as Corinne just referred to as well, when The World According to Garp came out in 1978, it was John Irving's breakthrough as a writer. He had already published 3 other books by that time, Setting Free the Bears, The Water Method Man, and The 158-Pound Marriage. But especially the last 2 had not been very great successes. And his publisher at the time, which is also the publisher, I think, at the present time, at that very moment thought there was very little need for a 4th John Irving book. With hindsight, it is pretty easy to say that, that this was probably the worst and most regretted decision ever taken by the editorial board of the Random House Company. Irving's new publisher at the time took no half measures. He read the manuscript, But he told Irving, before taking a decision on whether to publish it or not, that he wanted his cleaning lady to read it as well. Well, this was a joke, of course, but Irving was by that time uncertain of almost anything and possibly thought the publisher would be serious as well. Well, whether the cleaning lady indeed read the manuscript, my John Irving files don't tell me, but if she did, she must have loved the book, as have millions of readers and even a couple of critics ever since Garp was published almost 30 years ago. Well, the rest, as they say, is history. The World According to Garp was hailed as a great, funny and moving book about the war between the sexes, feminism, the family, wrestling, and writing. In 1981, Irving published The Hotel New Hampshire, a book about the horrors of rape and the hardships of a family trying to stay together in extremely difficult times. Another 4 years later, in 1985, The Cider House Rules was published, on the occasion of which, by the way, I had my first of many interesting interviews with Mr. Irving. The Cider House Rules has, since its publication, been praised for its unprecedented moral profundity. It is a book about an orphan in the best tradition of Jane Eyre, David Copperfield, and of course, Great Expectations, the very novel that made John Irving want to be a writer. The Cider House Rules is about the fascinating father-son relationship between Dr. Wilbur Large and the orphan Homer Wells, and is also a topical and engaged novel about the right to abortion. Another 4 years later, Irving published A Prayer for Owen Meany, again a novel about an outcast. Owen Meany is unbelievably small and has an irritatingly high-pitched voice that would silence even Truman Capote. And yet, he's a kind of a Christ figure. The book is about the corruption of the moral promise that the United States once meant to its citizens and to the outside world. More broadly speaking, one might say it deals with the idea of lost innocence, a recurring theme in Mr. Irving's works. 1994 saw the publication of A Son of the Circus, a book, as Mr. Irving himself says in a preface, about an Indian, definitely an Indian, but not an Indian. This, of course, sounds like yet another outcast, and so the protagonist is. That protagonist is called Dr. Farrokh Darawalla, an Indian by birth who studied in Vienna and now lives in Toronto. Every now and then he returns to his native Bombay, where he behaves more Indian than the Indians, but does not feel at home. Neither does he so in Toronto. A Son of the Circus is a book about spiritual rootlessness, a topical theme if ever there was one. It is dedicated to Salman Rushdie, who is without doubt the most politically controversial example of a spiritually rootless person. At the publication of this book in Britain, John Irving was interviewed by the Sunday Times magazine, which found the story of his life a bit too neat, too perfect. Aren't there any skeletons in the closet? The reporter asked. Mr. Irving declined, said he just had a boring life, and I'm sure he was honest at the time. 11 years later, however, after the publication of yet another 2 novels, A Widow for 1 Year and The Fourth Hand, he presented us with a book which suggested that there might have been a skeleton in the closet after all. This novel, Until I Find You, published last year, was announced as Mr. Irving's most personal novel to date. Not because it tells us the life story of John Irving, but because it deals more openly and explicitly than ever with a number of themes that have in fact been present in most of his works. Until I Find You tells the story of Jack Burns, who becomes a semi-orphan very early in life when his father leaves his mother. As most John Irving's readers had been aware for a long time, something similar happened to Irving himself. He had been publicly known it had been publicly known that he was born as John Wallace Blunt, Jr. in Exeter, New Hampshire in March 1942. Soon after, his parents divorced and John went to live with his grandparents. And when he was 6, his mother married Colin Irving, who adopted a boy and changed his name to John Winslow Irving. Mr. Irving has always insisted that Colin Irving was an excellent and loving father, as good as any biological father could possibly be. And there's no reason whatsoever to doubt this statement. Mr. Irving has also insisted that he never lost a night's sleep over his biological father and the fact that he never came to look for his son later in life. This statement, however, turned out to be a bit more doubtful. In an essay Mr. Irving wrote on the occasion of the publication of Until I Find You, he admitted that the absence and apparent disinterest from the side of his biological father had bothered him far more than he'd always cared to admit, even to himself. So there was a skeleton at last. It's about the nature of this skeleton and its influences on Until I Find You and most of his other novels that I will later on have a conversation with Mr. Irving. Before that, however, he will read to us, I believe, from so far unpublished work, or at least an adaptation of a published work. He will tell us himself. Mr. Irving, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. For the last 20 years, I've always been writing one or more screenplays concurrently with whatever novel I'm writing. It's a method that's worked very well for me because it forces me to step away from the novel I'm writing for periods of time upwards to 2 or 3 months. It never takes me longer than 2 or 3 months to write a draft of a screenplay. It usually takes me 5 or 6, or in the last case, 7 years to write a novel. So I find it works well to interrupt a novel, work on a screenplay for 2 or 3 months, and when I come back to the novel, I see things about the book that I never would have seen if that had been the only project in my life. So I think I would continue to be interested in writing films, even if the films were never made, or if I had never found directors and producers that I enjoyed collaborating with. But I've been lucky enough in the last few years to find a couple of people in studios, a couple of directors and one producer that I do enjoy a collaboration with. And perhaps because what I do most of the time is solitary, which writing a novel is, and I'm the only one who reads it and writes it and rewrites it and rewrites it for an extended period of time, the occasional collaboration, which a screenplay always is fun for a change. I would never stop writing novels to write screenplays, but I find that writing screenplays has helped me see my novels better, and it's a vacation from writing novels. Writing screenplays, which you always do with 1 or 2 other people, is a lot of fun in comparison to writing a novel, which I've never found much fun. It's an obsession, it's a compulsion to write a book. In my experience, it's kind of a social event to make a film in comparison. I'm working on 2 screenplays at the moment on parallel tracks. An adaptation of A Son of the Circus, which has now been in progress for 16 years, and which I have reinvented in the last 2 years in Mexico. I don't mean that we intend to shoot the film in Mexico and pretend that Mexico is India. I mean that I have transformed Dr. Darawala into Dr. Vargas, and that the children in formerly an Indian circus are Mexican children in a Mexican circus, and that the Jesuits formerly in Bombay are now in Oaxaca. It just became too difficult to make this film in India, and a big part of the problem was India. I felt that the same story, the same things that endanger those children could endanger them in Mexico. It only meant that the director and I had to do the same kind of homework, the same kind of location scouting that we did in Bombay and in Gujarat 16 years ago. And so it's taken a while to make that conversion. So that's one of the screenplays I'm writing. And the other one is an adaptation of The Fourth Hand. I'm doing The Fourth Hand with a young writer-director named Todd Williams, who also wrote and directed that adaptation of A Widow for 1 Year, which you may have seen. It was called The Door in the Floor. He wrote that screenplay. I didn't. In the case of The Fourth Hand, I'm writing it and he's directing it. But we had a pretty good collaboration over The Door on the Floor, especially in post-production, in editing. And so we're doing this screenplay in a slightly different way. I wrote the first draft, he wrote the second draft, I wrote the third draft. We keep passing it back and forth. I rewrite him, he rewrites me. I wasn't able to do that with Lasse Hallström when we made the Cider House Rules together, because Lasse makes no pretense of being a writer. He's just a director. So all the writing was mine. This kind of a collaboration is a little more fun because this guy, Todd Williams, is a writer as well as being a director, and he comes to being a film director from being a writer. So this project is a little different, and we keep passing it back and forth. It's hard to read from a screenplay because it's hard to sort of set the scenes. And one thing you have to keep in mind is this. If you saw this on film, it would take between 5 and 10 minutes fewer to see it than it's going to take me to read it. You got that? So the way you read a screenplay when you're reading it on the page is you read it once and you read all the scene headers. And then the next time you read it, you don't read the scene headers. Because in the film, you don't get to see the scene headers, right? They just take up too much time. But I'm going to have to do some sort of makeshift job of letting you know what the scene headers are. So that, imagine this. This is, honestly, it's the first 12 minutes of the movie, right? But it's probably going to take me 15 or 20 minutes to lay it out for you. But if you were watching this instead of hearing it, it's 12 minutes long, right? It's the first 12 minutes of the film. We may insert the opening credits over this 12 minutes. I'm not going to bother you with that. Or the opening credits may simply be shown over a surgical procedure of a hand transplant surgery. Just the surgery itself, okay? Well, we haven't made that decision yet. We're way away from deciding that. So either this will be the first 12 minutes of the film following the opening credits, which will be backgrounded by a surgical transplant, an actual surgical transplant, or we will find a way to put the opening credits into this opening 12 minutes. Because it's very fast, it's possible to do that. It's very fast opening 12 minutes. For those of you who don't know screenplays, ever read them or write them, the objective with the first 12 to 15 minutes of a screenplay is really just to get all the cards on the table. You want to set all the collision courses in motion, all the people who don't know each other yet who are going to meet, right? And you want to take the main stories and like fishing lines in the water, just throw them out there, right? Just throw them out there. Now, those of you who've read this book will remember that a New York television journalist loses his hand to a circus lion in an Indian circus in the opening of the book. Well, practically speaking, here's the first lesson. Nobody's going to give us the money to go to India for a 3-minute segment, okay? So this isn't going to happen in India. That's a dream, right? That's the way the book begins, but nobody's going to send a whole film crew to India for 3 minutes of a film. So I forgot that idea before I even began this, right? We're not going to India. The lion has to eat the hand in another place, right? That's an obvious change. And for those of you who are purists about novels, that may be the first and only lesson of interest. These 12 minutes are a prelude to that moment in a film when time changes, when the screen goes black and the text comes up upon the screen that will say 3 years later, okay? So what this young director and I have been passing back and forth between us for the last couple of months is how quickly can we get to the moment where the screen goes black and we can put the titles up that say 3 years later, because that's when the story begins. It begins 3 years later, right? This is all prologue, and the objective is make it happen before the first 15 minutes. Get it all out there before the first 15 minutes, and then when you get to the part that says 3 years later, then the movie begins, okay? I'll try to talk you through this as quickly as possible, because that's how it's supposed to move. A hospital room in Portland, Maine. Patrick Wallingford, 36, model, handsome, flanked by a TV crew, interviews a female trapeze artist. She's in a hospital bed with casts on both her arms. She says, "Flying without a net is what makes the trapeze act special." Wallingford asks, "But did your husband believe he could catch you if you fell?" The flyer says, "He knew he couldn't catch me, just break my fall." Wallingford says, "And did he know it might kill him to break your fall?" The woman says, "Yes, we both knew, but we were religious. We believed in eternal life." She doesn't sound at all sure. She can't continue. Wallingford tries to spare her, turning to camera. The blonde sound recordist, infatuated with him, can't take her eyes off him. Wallingford says, "This is Patrick Wallingford in Portland, Maine, where tragedy has struck one of the country's small remaining traveling circuses." The image pauses on Wallingford. Cut, newsroom, New York City, later that day. Wallingford's producer, Dick, is on the phone. Behind him, a stack of monitors, all paused on Patrick's face. Dick says, "The trapeze artist sucks. She's way too dry." Wallingford's voiceover is off camera. "You're just saying that because she's not hysterical. What about the religious part?" Interior, tech room, Portland, Maine, continuous. Patrick converses via a halting video conferencing device with his producer, Dick. Dick is saying, "I'm sick of religion." Wallingford, "They were a couple with young children, Dick." Dick says, "I'm sick of children, Pat." As Wallingford sighs, Dick continues, "Tell you what, go back to the circus. Talk to the lion tamer." Wallingford says, "The trapeze artist's husband is dead. He died trying to break her fall. There's nothing the matter with the lion tamer." Dick says, "Just be sure you're there at feeding time." Wallingford sounds resigned. Feeding time. Interior, hotel room, Portland, Maine, that night. Patrick makes love to the blonde sound recordist, Monica. She has a German accent. Wallingford says, "What's a German girl doing in Maine?" Monica, "Sound technicians can live anywhere there's sound." Wallingford says, "You might try to live in New York. There's a lot of sound there, and there's more to do at night." Monica says, "Is there something you'd rather be doing tonight?" The phone rings. Patrick ignores it at first, then answers it. "Hello?" Monica, worked up, kisses Patrick's neck. A woman's voice over the phone. "You're fucking someone, aren't you?" Patrick drills an urgent look into Monica, who has heard this. She lies still. Wallingford says, "No, Marilyn, I am not."
Marilyn, over the phone, says, I thought you'd like to know the results of your paternity test. Monica is listening. Patrick tries to keep them both still. Marilyn, over the phone, continues, well, it's negative. You're not the father. I guess you dodged that bullet, didn't you? Wallingford says, they gave you the results of my blood test? That was improper. It was my blood test. Monica says, what blood test? Marilyn, over the phone, says, who is she? Who are you fucking at this very minute? Who is she? Wallingford says to Monica, just tell her your name. Wallingford holds the phone to Monica's mouth. Monica says, Monica, with a K. Wallingford hangs up the receiver. He says, an ex-girlfriend. Monica says, recently ex, I suppose. Traveling circus, exterior, Portland, Maine, next morning. Wallingford is there with his film crew, interviewing the lion tamer next to the lion's cage. The lions are agitated. Lion tamer says, they were crazy not to use the net. The woman weighs 160. Her husband was a 145-pounder max, and she's falling from 60 feet. You do the math. Wallingford says, what's the matter with the lions? The lion tamer says, they're not used to waiting to be fed. The cameraman is photographing the meat cart. Wallingford says, we need an establishing shot of the meat. The butcher boys are uneasy with the way the lions are behaving. Wallingford continues to Monica, are you getting the lions? Monica says, you have the mic. Wallingford extends his microphone to within reach of the lion's cage. A lion's paw flicks out, catching his wrist. The mic falls, his hand is bitten off. Wallingford watches his watch slide off his wrist. He turns to the cameraman. Did you get that? He faints. Monica faints too. She falls into the meat cart, to the consternation of the butcher boys. The cameraman keeps filming. 2 acrobats rush to Wallingford's aid. Other lions in the cage compete for Wallingford's severed hand. The acrobats are covered with Wallingford's blood. The butcher boys, in attempting to assist Monica, roll her over, revealing the chest of Monica's tank top. Both breasts are blood-soaked from the meat. The camera keeps rolling. Interior, a posh city apartment, New York City, that night. The footage of the hand-eating accident is on TV. An attractive 40-year-old woman is watching with her teenage daughter. The daughter says, I never knew you slept with him. The woman says, you were a little kid. The daughter says, but were you still with Daddy? The woman says, your father was away. He was away a lot. On the TV, it's the scene where they roll Monica over, revealing her blood-soaked breasts. The woman continues, I'll bet he was fucking her. On the TV, the lions are fighting over the hand. The woman continues, it's too bad it was just his hand. The daughter is disgusted. She says, they keep showing this every 15 minutes. I'm going to bed. I think I'll watch it one more time, the woman says. Interior, a living room, Green Bay, Wisconsin, same night. Otto Clausen and his wife, Doris, in their 30s, sit on the couch. He's wearing a Packers hat. She's in a Green Bay t-shirt. They're watching the Wallingford episode on TV. Doris says, I'd give that poor man my own hand if I was dying. Wouldn't you, Otto? Otto replies, I don't know. I don't even know him. A hand isn't like an organ that nobody sees. It's a recognizable part of you, Doris. Doris says, when you're dead, Otto. She's watching the television. He looks like a paternity suit waiting to happen. Otto says, is that why you want to give him my hand? Doris says, I didn't say that. I just said when you're dead, you're dead. Otto says, I got that part. But why my hand? Why him? Clearly, Doris says, because he needs a hand. On the TV, the fainted Monica lies in the meat. Otto says, do you think he was banging the blonde? Doris cuddles up to him. She doesn't want to think about Wallingford and Monica. She says, want to try and make a baby? What were you going to do right now, anyway? Nothing this good, right? Otto sounds strangely defeated. Right, he says. As they start to get serious, the TV replays the attack on the hand. Otto says, geez, they just keep showing it. As Otto mounts his wife, Mrs. Clausen can see the lion attack on the TV over his shoulder. She can't stop watching it. Stop, lion attack footage. Rewind, TV boardroom, New York City, next morning. The critical expressions of the network's management as they review this footage. Dick, the news editor. Sabina, a middle-aged woman and an executive producer. Wharton, a rising young CEO. And Mary, a pretty producer. Mary says, "Is he one of our field reporters or from some Maine affiliate?" Dick says, "Wallingford's all ours. He's from New York." "Why did we send him to Maine?" Mary asks. "He's got a soft spot for human interest stories," Wharton says. "You know, wife falls on husband, kills him." Sabina says sadistically, "Patrick's a real human interest kind of guy." On the TV, there's a replay. Wallingford is saying, "We need an establishing shot of the meet." To Monica, he says, "Are you getting the lions?" Monica says, "You have the mic." Freeze to a still. Cut back to Sabina holding the remote. She says, "If Patrick wasn't already sleeping with the sound recordist, he was planning on it." Dick says, "We should lose the sound recordist." On Wharton and the others at the round table. They're all watching the TV. "Here it comes," Wharton says. "I don't think I can watch this again," Mary says. Sabina says vengefully, "I can. I could watch it forever." Wallingford's voice is off camera. "Did you get that?" On the TV, rewind, the lion attack in reverse, then replayed. On the faces at the round table, Mary almost doesn't look. Wharton is fascinated. Dick is expressionless. Sabina is enthralled. Wallingford's voice is off camera again. "Did you get that?" On the TV, we see Monica sprawled in the meat. Sabina says, "He was definitely banging the sound recordist." Sabina gets up from the table. On the TV, the details the cameraman captured. Wallingford's watch lies in the dirt near the microphone. The butcher boys turn Monica over. Wallingford lies in the acrobat's arms. At the round table, on Dick, Wharton, and Mary, as Sabina abruptly leaves the boardroom, Mary asks, "You want to fill me in about Sabina?" Dick says, "Sabina had a little thing with Wallingford." Wharton says, "Hasn't everyone had a little thing with Wallingford?" Mary says, "Wallingford hasn't had a little thing with me, Wharton." Wharton says, "You haven't met Patrick Wallingford, Mary." Mary ignores this insult. She speaks to Dick, her eyes on the TV. "We can do a lot with this lion guy." Wharton asks, "What can we do with a one-handed field reporter?" "Don't you get it, Wharton?" Mary asks. "Wallingford likes human interest stories. We'll make him our disaster man. We'll have him report on seriously stupid calamities, like the one that happened to him." On the TV, we see again Monica's bloody breasts. Dick, off camera, says, on second thought, "Keep the sound recordist." There's a close-up on Mary, her eyes narrowing. Mary says, "Definitely keep her." Fade to black, a nurse's voice over. "Mr. Wallingford." Fade quickly in, the lion's cage, from Wallingford's point of view. A close-up, the lion's claw catches Wallingford's wrist, the paw pulls his arm inside the cage, the lion's mouth chomps the hand. The nurse's voice over again says, "Mr. Wallingford." Hospital room, Portland, Maine, continuous. Wallingford wakes in terror, sees the nurse. "Ah, here you are," the nurse says. "Back in the world." Wallingford stares at his bandaged left wrist. The bandage is as big as a catcher's mitt. It not only looks as if he has a left hand, it appears that his left hand is huge. Wallingford asks, "Did they put it back on?" The nurse says, No, that's all bandage under there. Your hand is gone." "The lion ate it?" Wallingford asks. "2 or 3 lions, actually," the nurse says. "They kind of shared it." On the TV, the lions are savagely fighting over Wallingford's hand. Pull back, TV makeup room, New York City, continuous. Angie, the makeup girl, in her 20s, chews gum nonstop. She is wearing a short-sleeved V-neck sweater, sexual dynamite, the color of orange sherbet, and a tight black skirt. Angie is applying makeup to Betsy Jackman, an attractive anchor woman in her late 30s or early 40s. They're watching the now familiar footage of Patrick Wallingford's hand being eaten on the makeup room TV. The sound is off. Angie says, "One hand or no hands? He's hot, huh?" Betsy says, "Hot?" Angie pulls her sweater away from her chest and blows down her cleavage. "Yeah, hot," Angie says. "You think so?" Betsy asks. "You don't think so?" Angie asks. Mary, frowning, enters the makeup room. To Betsy, Mary says, "You won't go to Maine." Betsy says, "When my kids get home from school, I'm home. That's how it is." Mary says, "Betsy, I need an interview with Wallingford before he gets out of the hospital." Betsy says, "I got kids, Mary. We have an affiliate in Boston. Don't they have someone?" "He looks like a mortician," Mary says. "I don't want our viewers to think Wallingford is going to die." Betsy says, "Mary, you could do it. You'd be great on camera." Mary, as she's leaving, says, "Yes, I would be, but I wanted you." Angie tries to direct Betsy's attention back to Wallingford on the muted TV. "So," Angie says, "you don't think he's hot?" Betsy says with feigned indifference, "He's not hot enough to make me go to Maine." "Ha," Angie says. Surgery. Cambridge, Massachusetts, TV file footage. Dr. Zajac is operating with a team of surgeons. It's a hand transplant surgery, very technical. Betsy's voiceover says, "While our reporter Patrick Wallingford is still recovering from the lion attack that cost him his left hand, we can't help but recall the ground-breaking surgery of Dr. Nicholas M. Zajac, a professor of clinical surgery at Harvard Medical School and the foremost hand surgeon in Massachusetts. Dr. Zajac and his team performed the Boston area's first successful hand transplant procedure and only the second such surgery nationwide in the summer of 1999. On Betsy Jackman in the newsroom, speaking to camera, she continues, "Of course, it's premature to speculate, but if the lion guy were ever to consider hand transplant surgery, Dr. Zajac would be the likeliest choice for the procedure in the Northeast." Pull back. Hospital room, Portland, Maine. Continuous. Wallingford and the nurse are watching Betsy on TV. Wallingford says, "The lion guy?" The nurse smiles. Wallingford, dazed, stares past her at the TV. The replay of the lion attack now has music over. Surgeon's waiting room, Cambridge, Massachusetts, continuous. Various patients with hand injuries await attention while riveted to the lion attack on TV, among them Olivia, a blonde beauty with both hands heavily bandaged, and a small boy lying horror-stricken in his mother's lap, one hand in a cast. The receptionist, anxious about the effect of the hand eating on the boy, knocks on the doctor's examination room door. As the receptionist comes inside, she interrupts the meeting Zajac is having with his surgical associates, Schatzman, Gingileski, and Mengerink. The receptionist says, "They're showing it again. I don't know if it's suitable for the child." Zajac's colleagues bolt past her to see the footage for themselves, leaving Zajac and the receptionist to consider the abandoned examining room, the various photographs of sports stars, the models of hands and prosthetic hands. On the TV, the grisly aftermath of the lion attack before the screen goes black. Surgeon's waiting room, continuous. Zajac has shut off the television to the relief of the child's mother and Olivia with her two bandaged hands. Zajac's disappointed colleagues follow him back inside the examination room, the receptionist shutting the door. In the room, Gingileski says, "Come on, Nick. We know you can do it." Zajac says, "This poor guy is still seeing lions. He's not thinking about being the recipient of someone else's hand." Mengerink says, "Nick, the guy's a television journalist." Schatzman says, "The lion attack is on film." Gingileski says, "The hand-eating episode is on TV. International news," Mengerink says. "Not like the last time. Last time," Schatzman says, "they virtually ignored us." Zajac gives him a questioning look. "You, I mean, Nick," Schatzman says. "They ignored you." Zajac says, "It's not about us. It's about the guy who gets the hand and all that goes with it." "Nick," Schatzman says, You're not assuming that the lion guy doesn't want a left hand, are you? Zajac says, my only assumption is that the lion guy wishes he had his left hand back, his own left hand. Exterior suburbs, Green Bay, Wisconsin, evening. A beer truck is parked in the Clausen's driveway. Otto's voiceover is off camera. Are you ovulating? Interior, Clausen's house, continuous. Doris, wearing a sexy nightie, is brushing her teeth in the bathroom. She says, you bet I am. In the bedroom, Otto, in Packer's gym shorts, is playing with a VCR recording of the Lion Guy episode. He says, you were ovulating the last time too, weren't you? Doris comes in the bedroom, kneels on the bed. In a very sexy voice, she says, for you, I'm always ovulating. They start fooling around as the lion episode unfolds. Otto says more seriously, yeah, what if I'm the problem? Doris is also serious. Don't say that. You haven't tried nearly hard enough. You like trying, don't you? Otto says, I love you. Doris is still watching the lion guy. Why did you want to record this, Otto? She says. You asked me to record it, Otto says. Yeah, but you wanted to, Doris says. Everyone wants to record it, Otto says. Why? Doris asks. Their lovemaking is now more serious. Otto says, I just heard that on the radio, in the beer truck. Everyone is recording it. They roll on the TV remote, hitting the volume. The lions fighting over the hand is ultra loud, terrifying, stopping their lovemaking until Otto can find the remote and lower the volume. Doris is upset. Turn it off, Otto. Screen goes black, fade in. Zajac's house, Cambridge, Massachusetts, evening. Zajac sits at the dining room table where his wife, Irma, in spandex workout clothes, a very fit-looking woman, serves their dinner. She says, what did his wrist look like? Like a lion bit off his hand, Zajac said. You saw it on TV, same as I did. Irma is talking about the dinner. Roast chicken with lemon and rosemary, scalloped potatoes and Brussels sprouts. I finished the sprouts under the broiler with a little olive oil and Parmesan. She looks closely at her husband. Zajac is still angry about his colleagues. What's wrong, Nicky? Irma asks him. I just hate all the lion guy stuff, Zajac says. They show it every 15 minutes, Irma says. Zajac looks at his watch. You want to see it again? His wife asks. Zajac nods, disheartened. Irma quickly grabs her dinner plate, silverware, napkin, wine glass. Zajac seizes the wine bottle, too. Irma says, why don't we just record it? Interior, hospital corridor, Portland, Maine, next morning. Mary leads her TV crew as if they own the place. This time, there's a camera woman and a male sound recordist. We recognize the nurse who was with Wallingford. She stops them at the door to his room. I'm sorry, the nurse says. Mr. Wallingford is asleep. Mary pushes past her. Asleep is good, Mary says. Hospital room, Portland, Maine, continuous. The camera woman sets up at the foot of the bed. The sound recordist establishes an overhead mic while Mary settles herself in a bedside chair and draws close to the sleeping Wallingford. By her expression, we can tell that Mary is unprepared for how beautiful looking and peacefully asleep Patrick is. The nurse is hovering nearby. Pretty, isn't he? The nurse says. Mary says to the sound recordist, did you get that? Sound recordist says, oh yeah. Mary smiles insincerely at the nurse. There's a text over black. 3 years later.
Now, John, in your introduction to your reading, you explain a couple of reasons why you like to be involved with the movie business in between novel writing. But when I read your last book, your latest book, and everything you told the stories you told around that book, I also wondered how hard would it be for you to sort of start writing a new novel, because it looks as though most of your writing career led up to Until I Find You. And is it possible at all to make a new start? Or would it feel like a new start, actually, if you started to write a 12th novel?
Well, actually, it was a great relief to have finished this novel. My process is a very slow one. I don't mean by that only that I write slowly, and I spend 3/4 of my life as a writer rewriting. I mean that when something has had an emotional or psychological effect on me, my inclination is to not write about it. My inclination is to hold it at some distance from myself, and to create as much separation as possible between the act of writing about those things and their emotional impact on me. For example, my Vietnam novel, A Prayer for Owen Meany, was written 20 years after the war. My abortion novel, The Cider House Rules, I purposely set in the 1930s and 40s to move that subject as far away from the present political climate involving the abortion debate as possible. And it was very typical of me to, not in my first or my second or my third novel, but in my 11th novel, when I was already in my late 50s and knew I would be in my 60s before I finished this long book. It was very typical of me to say, now I can write about things that affected me strongly when I was a child and when I was a teenager, because by the time I began Until I Find You, I have 3 children who are already older than Jack Burns is at the beginning of that novel. I'm a long way away from those things and what happened to me as a child and a teenager. I remember them. I remember their effect on me when I was younger, but Until I Find You would have been a very different novel if I'd written it in my 20s or in my early 30s. Owen Meany would have been a very different novel if I'd written it at the end or at the conclusion of the Vietnam War, when the friends I'd lost there and the fact that I came this close to going there myself were very much a part of my conscience.
The books would have been marred by emotion and everything?
Well, I'm not an intellectual. I don't write books for intellectual reasons. I write novels for emotional reasons, psychological reasons. My intention is to move you, not to make you think. You ought to know how to think by yourself. I'm not interested in that process. Jack Burns' psychiatrist says to him at one point, just tell me what made you laugh, what made you cry, and what made you angry. Well, that's good enough for me. I don't know how good that advice is from a psychotherapist, but I know that it's good enough advice for me as a storyteller. I want to write about the things that I hope will make you laugh, will make you cry, and will make you angry. The rest of it, I don't care about. I leave out those other things. So I felt that at some distance, as I felt I was, from my childhood and my teenage years, I could write about some of those things, the too early sexual experience, the missing father, the anger at the mother, all of those issues, because I wasn't angry at my mother anymore. If I was in my 20s and I wrote this novel, I'd have a hard time knowing who's Alice and who's my mother. I have no trouble knowing who's Alice and who's my mother when I began this novel in my late 50s. And my mother was already in her 80s. I stopped being angry at my mother maybe in my middle 40s. And I stopped thinking about the woman who in her 20s had sex with me when I was 11. I stopped thinking about her from the moment I became a father, and my only concern was to be certain that my children had a better childhood than I had had. Naturally, you can't create characters, write new situations about experiences that are based on things that happened to you, and not recover a lot of memories you have happily forgotten for 20 or 30 years. You know, that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
It happened when I wrote A Prayer for Owen Meany. It happened when I wrote the Cider House Rules, and it happened for a lot longer when I was writing Until I Find You. But I have never finished a novel and not known before I finished it not only what my next novel is likely to be, but I have a pretty good idea about the one after that. So given the difficulty of this novel, just architecturally, its length, its complexity, I got, for me, a very early start into my 12th novel, far sooner than normally happens for me, sooner than I expected. I always begin, as we've talked about before, I always begin with a last sentence and a last couple of pages, and I know what happens at the ending, and not only do I know what happens, I know the voice that the ending is written in, and when I know that, I can make my way back to where I think the novel should begin. Making that map, it takes usually a year, sometimes 18 months, but in this case, I got the last sentence in January of 2005, and I wrote the first chapter in August of 2005, and another 150 manuscript pages in the fall of last year, before I purposely interrupted it, put it away, and went back to work on these screenplays.
Yes.
If everything kind of goes the way it's looking, it will. I don't expect to be back to work on that novel before the end of this summer, literally a year after I began it. And that would be a good period of time for me to have been not thinking about it, not writing it, not even reading it. I know that if I stay away from it for that long, I'm going to see some things that I'll want to change in not only the pages I've written, but in the architecture of the novel as it is presently
But is that the usual
planned.
way you work? Is that a usual procedure to start writing something and then maybe do something else in between? And
it's been
return
usual
to
for
it?
20 years.
Yes.
I was working this way. I got in the habit of interrupting the novel A Prayer for Owen Meany when I was writing the early drafts of the screenplay for the Cider House Rules. And whenever I came back to Owen Meany, I'd learned so much from the time away that I saw things about the book that I know I wouldn't have seen otherwise. And so I just decided that that was a good way for me to work. But it began for me when I was beginning A Prayer for Owen Meany. At the same time, I was writing the first 2-3 drafts of the Cider House Rules screenplay, and that just worked so well that I thought I should keep doing this. You know, I should keep working intensely on one thing, and then you get it to a place where you think it might be a good moment to step away, come back.
Now, you just said that Until I Find You was basically the hardest novel to write. Was that merely or mainly a technical question, a technical affair, or was it rather an emotional reason behind that?
The hardest thing about any novel is rewriting it. the hardest thing about any novel to me is the fine tuning, is how many times I revise every sentence. There's a very common misunderstanding about novels, about fiction. I read all the time that novels that are very small, very thin, there is something about their size when they're small that makes critics think that every word and every sentence has been more carefully tuned, more finely tuned, that little novel has been reworked, the prose in it has been reworked more than the prose in those big, sloppy, long novels. Mm-hmm. And in my experience, that's bullshit. In my experience, the shorter the thing you write, the fewer times you have to pass through it. I may revise a screenplay of 125 typed pages with very wide margins. I may revise a screenplay of 125 pages, 6, 8, 10 times. A novel, the longer it is, it's 50, 60, 70 times every sentence. The longer it is and the longer you've been doing it, the more times you pass through it, the more times you see every sentence, the more times you tweak every sentence. That's the hard part of writing novels for me. Mostly my novels are long, and the reason they're long is pretty obvious. They're not about a summer in somebody's life. They're not about a weekend in a failing marriage. They're about a childhood and who that child becomes as an adult. They're about a passage of time that is always between 10 to 15 to 20 to 30 years. Those aren't short novels. If the passage of time is as important to you as a writer as any major minor character in the story, you are not going to pass through that book quickly, and nor is the reader, right? It's just that's just a fact. And in the case of Until I Find You, I knew before I wrote the first word, it was going to be maybe a third again longer than any book I've written, because guess what? Jack Burns has 2 childhoods. He has the whole opening act 1 of this play in 5 acts, which is the childhood he imagines he's had, the childhood that his mother has largely manipulated for him to believe in, and in the 3rd act, he has the childhood that he really had. So I knew I was going to have to disassemble Act 1 in one of the later acts of the play and give him a whole new childhood. So I knew I was going to be visiting that territory twice. So even in the architecture of the book, even in the street map that I made of the book before I wrote the first sentence, I'm thinking this is 7 or 8 years. I knew it was a play in 5 acts, just as I knew A Widow for 1 Year was a play in 3 acts before I wrote the first word. I remember saying to my wife, this thing's going to be almost 40 chapters long. It was 39. That was 8 years ago that I thought it was going to be 40. I don't know what happened to that chapter. Oh, yes, I do. Yes, I actually do. There was a Hamburg chapter, and I took Hamburg out. I decided that I wanted to keep them away I wanted to keep Jack and his mother out of Hamburg for some complicated reasons.
Now, there was a specific string of events, I think, that maybe triggered your awareness of you being, of you not knowing, never having known your biological father, and perhaps being more disturbed by that than you cared to admit to yourself, which was, I think, a number of interviews and correspondence with the New York journalist Mel Gussow. Could you tell us a bit about how that went about? So actually there was a number of events or conversations which actually, I think, tuned your awareness of why you always wanted to write about orphans and why certain subjects came back to you in every novel, or most of your novels.
Well, when you're a child and a door is closed repeatedly, what you say to yourself as a child is, this doesn't matter to me. After the 10th or 12th or 20th or 30th time that you try to get an answer from somebody about well, tell me something about who this guy was. After all, I have his name, you know. If you're going to call me John Wallace Blunt Jr., don't you think you could say a little bit about who John Wallace Blunt was? It seemed to me a reasonable question. But when everyone in my family just stonewalled that question, not abusively, nobody ever got mad at me, nobody ever, made me feel like a fool for asking, but it was just that no answer was forthcoming. My mother would just shake her head and say, I'm sorry, no, can't go there. And even my grandmother, who was far more candid with me than my mother, and my grandmother's housekeeper, who was far more candid than anybody I was related to by blood, even they had been sworn to a kind of pact. My mother had kind of got to them all, you know, and so a couple of things happened. I mean, when something that you're curious about it's simply a closed door, and the only people who ever talked to me about it were my cousins, and they didn't know much more than I did, and it turned out that half of the things they told me were wrong, because they were children too, and even the one who was the oldest had only, nobody had sat down and had a conversation with him. He just happened to overhear his mother, my aunt, having conversations with his father, my uncle. He'd simply overheard some conversations that I wasn't privileged to hear. But he got half of it wrong, as it turned out. But that was my only source. My older cousins were my only source of information about who this guy was and what might have happened to him and why he never was around. Well, what happens to you as a kid is you realize that this makes everybody uncomfortable, and you're not going to get an answer. And so what you say to yourself is, it's not important. Because if you're a child and you allow yourself to think it's important, it's pretty upsetting. So you basically say, or I did, he must have been really awful. Mm-hmm. I mean, nobody made him out to be a devil. Quite the opposite of Alice in Until I Find You, who is willfully manipulating Jack's impression of who his missing father might be. Nobody did that to me. I did it to me. I thought, well, how bad a guy must this be if no adult in my family will ever talk to me? What are they trying to protect me from? You know, what are they trying to keep from me that they think might upset me? Is he a murderer? Is he a criminal? Am I going to turn out like him? So because of all those things, the easiest thing to do psychologically was to say, well, I don't give a shit about him. The easiest thing to do is to say, I don't care who he is. And I learned to do that at a pretty early age. My cousins were always saying, well, you know, we can find out who he is, we can find him. And the older everybody got, all of my friends, everybody in my family was always on the case of, you know, let's go find John's father. And I could have found him in 2 days. He was in the military, I knew that much. The army would have helped me find him. It would have taken no time at all. After all, I knew his name. I mean, I had it, right? It wouldn't have been hard, you know. But I decided that it was better not to know. And that now, if when my mother remarried and I was adopted and I got this other man's name, if I'd hated that guy, if my stepfather had been a bad man and he'd made me unhappy or my mother unhappy, well, I think things might have turned out differently. I think then I would have wanted to find out who this missing guy was. But the truth is, my stepfather was sort of the happiest event in my early childhood. I loved him. He was a good guy. He made my mother happy. I hadn't seen my mother be happy before. For the first time, there was a man around. Because I grew up with all these women. My grandmother, my aunts, my mother occasionally, my grandmother's housekeeper. There were just all these women who ran the house. They ran everything. And until I was 6 and this stepfather came along, I wasn't around many men. My uncles were scared to death of their wives. Everybody was scared of my mother. And even my aunts and my mother were scared of my grandmother. So there were all these kind of terrifying women who told everybody else what to do. And, then along came this rather mild-mannered guy who didn't yell and scream, and that was my stepfather. And I thought, well, this is interesting. He's calm. He doesn't throw things. I was very fond of him. And I couldn't have been happier to be named after someone I could see and someone I liked. I was so happy to be rid of the name of this guy I assumed was some kind of axe murderer. At least I'd made him out to be, you see. And then that changed, as you know, again. But much later in my life, I was 39. I was divorcing my first wife. I had custody of what were then my 16 and 12-year-old sons. It was a difficult time. And my mother walked into my house and put a bunch of letters on my dining room table and said, Mary, you might be interested in these. And that was the only conversation we ever had about it. But I was indeed interested in these letters. They were all written from my father from the Asian theater of the war in 1943. He'd been a pilot. He and his crew were shot down over Burma. They hiked into China. He was in hospital in China for quite a number of months. And most of these letters were written from the hospital in China in the late summer and early fall of 1943. And they all, much to my surprise, expressed his a very well-worded desire to not be married to my mother, and his equally well-worded desire to have some relationship with me. She said no. And as a kid, I had been angry at my mother for not talking to me about him. But from the moment I became a father, which happened to me when I was very young, I was still in university, I was 23, from the moment my first son was born, I got angry at my father. I thought, what kind of a wimp is he that he won't come see me? I mean, okay, when I'm a child, when I'm living in my mother's house with my stepfather, maybe he has to keep his distance. But once I became an adult and had children of my own and a life of my own, what was stopping him? So that once I became a father, the anger kind of went elsewhere, I sort of said, well, my mother must know something I don't, she must be really right about this guy, because who is he that he has no interest? And that thought was confused or compounded by the fact that I'd heard these stories from my cousin that he used to come to my wrestling matches. They were public. There was a crowd. Nobody would have known if he was there. And so that was a conflict somehow. The idea that he came occasionally to see me wrestle, and later, of course, I imagined that maybe he read my books. I took information in those letters that he wrote to my mother from 1943. I took stuff about the diseases from the jungle, the dysentery, the malaria, and so forth, the infections from fly bites and stuff, that, pretty concrete details from those letters, and I gave them to the character of Wally in the Cider House Rules. It was just a way of saying, hello, if you read this, guess what I know? Guess what I've seen? But there's no corroboration, there's no evidence that he ever did read a novel of mine. If he did, he never told anybody that he did. And years later, my cousin couldn't remember ever telling me that my father had come to my wrestling matches. So naturally, I concluded that I'd made the whole thing up, that just because I wanted him to be interested in me, I had decided that he came to see me wrestle. And the cousin whom I most trusted had no memory of ever telling me this story. Well, that was kind of strange. As you know, so much of this novel is about how unreliable,
a child's memory really is, how you get things wrong, how things that seem so vivid, maybe they weren't quite that way, right? So I had lots of reasons to sort of doubt my information, and I had no reason to doubt my imagination. I live on it. So it was logical for me to assume that my cousin never told me that story, and that it was a story I had, over some years of deconstruction, invented or entirely made up. It was years later when I met my sister that I didn't know was my sister, and she remembered being in a town at a certain time and place with her father, and she asked her mother, "Why are we here?" And her mother said, "Well, years ago your father had another child. He's fine now. Your father's just here to see if he's okay. Don't think about it." This was a surprise to my sister, but it did indeed coincide with an important period of time in my wrestling season. So there does seem to be some corroboration that he came to see me wrestle once, or that time, but does that mean that he came more than once? Nobody knows, it's speculation. My guess is not. My guess is it was a surprise to me, having for a period of my life imagined that he might always be there, then going through a period of my life thinking that he'd never been there, and then to find out that, well, at least one time he was there. So at least he knew what my name was, and he would have had to have known that because when I was legally adopted, he had to be told. So he knew that I was no longer John Wallace Blunt Jr., that my name had been changed to John Irving, and we also know he knew that because he named another of his children John Wallace Blunt Jr. And I don't think he named two kids. You don't give two kids the same name. That's not likely, right? He had to know that there was no longer a John Wallace Blunt Jr. So it's a mystery, right? But I used to tease my mother as a way of trying to goad her into telling me things. I used to say, if you don't ever tell me anything about him, I'm just going to go on writing about it, and making him up, and indeed, of course, she never liked any of those things I wrote. So it was a way of, whenever she'd complain to me, for example, about the missing father in a prayer for Owen Meany, which is dedicated to her and my stepfather. I knew this book would make her angry, so I dedicated it to her. But I dedicated it to my stepfather too, and that was genuine, right? Because I really liked him, But I didn't fool anybody, because my mother knew that I was just sort of trying to get her to talk, and basically, she's very stubborn, She didn't say anything to me about the book. She went to my wife and said, next time you're talking to Johnny, just tell him it wasn't anything like that. That was it.
Yeah. She's still alive?
She didn't tell me. She told my wife,
Yeah. Is she still alive, actually, your mother?
Oh, yeah. She's still alive. Yeah, she's still alive.
Very much awaiting your next novel, no doubt.
No, she hasn't read the last couple of them. She hasn't read the last. She's not well, She's been sick for a while. She's not doing too well. But she's very much alive, and we still don't talk about a lot of things. That's all.
Is anybody in the audience who'd like to ask Mr. Irving a question? Mm-hmm. There are, I believe, two microphones. If you could ask your question, first maybe you and then the lady. In the microphone, everybody can hear it.
I have two questions. In the last novel, William does turn up in the end, so you made that up, obviously. And the second thing is, could you elaborate a little bit on the littleness of all your people? They're always very little boys. How come? What's the explanation of this? Including Jack Burns, who's also a tiny little guy.
They're very different questions.
Well, as I said earlier, I begin with an ending. So I knew where William was at the end of this novel. I began there. I began with William in Zurich. I knew where he was. I knew all the things that had happened to him and his condition, the degree to which he's a damaged guy. But from the beginning, I knew that he was a positive force. I knew that he was crazy, but that he was a lovable character, and that he was not the monster that Alice has made him out to be to Jack. I suppose when I conceived this novel, when I wrote that ending with William playing the organ concert, it was a kind of wishful thinking. It was an interesting way to imagine that one day I might find my father. He had an excuse for not coming to me. He was institutionalized. He couldn't get out, right? But he was really a nice guy. So there was a strong amount of, and there's another thing about that ending and William in it, is that I tend to do this with my most unhappy novels, of which I would count the Cider House Rules and Until I Find You at sort of near the top. The more dysfunctional, the more perversely damaging the story, the happier the ending, right? The more positive or uplifting the story, Prayer for Owen Meany, the unhappier the ending, right? I just do that. I don't know why, but I want a part of the process of knowing the story before I begin to write it is not only that I can lead you through it, but that I can mislead you. I can make you think that something is going here when it's really going there. But I can't mislead you if I don't know where it's going myself, can I? So I have to. It's a given that I have to know that before before I begin. It probably was very affirming, a very confirming moment for me to hear from this guy who said, "I think I'm your brother," in 2001 when I had written that last chapter, that ending, even 3 years before. And although I hadn't made my way all the way up to that last chapter, it already existed. The end of the novel was there, as it always is, kind of waiting for me to catch up to it. And when I heard from this guy who said, I think I'm your brother, in December of 2001, I was 3/4 of the way through the novel. And when I heard from him that in his estimation and in the estimation of another brother and my sister, children who'd grown up with my father, that in their eyes he was a good guy and a good father. Crazy, but a good guy and a good father. It seemed to bear out for me that I had, in the case of this novel, guessed right, so that nothing changed in the novel as a result of suddenly all these people named Blunt coming into it. It was too bad that when my brother found me, my father had been dead for 5 years. But at the same time, it was positive to hear that he'd been a positive presence in their lives. Must have been disconcerting to my brother, who was making breakfast for his children one morning, and he saw me on television and thought it was his father, who died some time ago, because I look like him. And then he heard the TV guy say, born John Wallace Blunt, Jr. In 1942, and Chris remembered that when he was 22, our father set him down for a little birthday conversation and said, when I was your age, I got a woman pregnant, and she had a baby, and I hardly ever see him. So be careful. And that was the only thing that Chris knew about me. But he remembered the age, you see, so that when he heard 1942, he thought, how old was my father in 1942? 22, bingo. And it's not that usual a name, right? John Wallace Blunt. It's too big. It was pretty easy. But he could have found it out 3 or 4 years ago, or before then, because there'd been these pieces in the New York Times by Mel Gusso, the guy you're talking about, and there'd been no secret that I was born with one name, that I never met my father, and that I'd been legally adopted and my name was changed. People who read everything knew that, right? It wasn't. It never had been a secret. But he missed it, and he'd read a number of my books, but of course there was no reason for him to make the connection, because I saw myself in that world. In a wrestling gym, I was one of the lightweights, and you worked out on a different part of the mat than the heavyweights, because you didn't want a heavyweight to roll on you while you were working out with another lightweight, right? You didn't want to. You kept your place, kind of, when they had weigh-ins, you weighed in with your own weight class, and you were gone. You were already getting dressed by the time the heavyweights weighed in. You never saw them. So I had a sense of myself, I suppose, as a small person. I was still growing when I started wrestling seriously. I was only 14, but it was a big part of my life for a long time. And in fact, I would have continued to compete past the age of 34. When I stopped, it was the weight cutting that got to me. I hadn't had any bad injuries. I was still pretty competitive, but I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't take weighing 136 and a half pounds when, every Monday I weighed 145 and a half, and, Friday night I was 136 and a half. And after a time, it's just hard, it makes you really a little, all you think about is it gives you a very bad disposition. Let's put it that way. I mean, as a kid, as a child, as a teenager, I had lots of reasons to be angry, and I was angry a lot of the time. And I think that may have been one of the biggest attractions that I felt to this sport. But later, I think I was angry because I was starving, because I was hungry, and it was a world that that was what became too much. I mean, for years after I stopped competing, I still was a sparring partner for my grown children and other young wrestlers. I still was a coach and a trainer until I was 47, but I wasn't trying to make weight anymore. I had a normal life. When you're eating that many calories a day, you're not normal ever. You're always a little angry. You're always a little ready to kick the screen out of the window or something. It's a little, I'm not trying to sound too psychotic about it, but you raise a sort of delicate question here. The size was a big deal for me. Now, on a more serious level, I had a sexual relationship with a woman in her 20s for several months when I was 11 years old. And that makes you feel pretty small. That keeps you feeling like you're not quite sure what you are or who you are. And it has, it has its own effect. So I think that there are the obvious thing is the wrestling. The sexual stuff was it was damaging, and I kind of got over it because becoming a father was the first normal thing that happened to me, and I was lucky that it happened to me when I was still pretty young, and it's been such a constant in my life for so many years. I was saying to Hans tonight that for 41 years, one or more of my children has lived with me under my roof. That's a long time to have children in your life. And not 1 year between the age of 23 and the age of 64 have I lived in a house without one or more of my kids living in it. The subject of childhood and what happens to you or happens to you as a result of that childhood has always been what I write about. My first son was born before I wrote my first novel. So my world has always been a scary place where bad things happen, and they happen in childhood. Or they can happen there. So and I think that, we've been talking about some autobiographical things. Well, it's autobiographical in another way. If you write about things that haven't happened to you, but you're writing about things that you hope never will happen to you or to your children. There's a little bit of something autobiographical in that, in a psychological way. This character in Until I Find You, Emma, she has ancestors. There's a Hester in A Prayer for Owen Meany. There's a Melanie in the Cider House Rules. Who is she? This bigger, older, stronger, sexually aggressive young woman who, when you first meet her, looks like a menace, a threat to the younger, more innocent male character. But in the end, turns out to be that character's best friend, only protector. I don't know who she is. She's not autobiographical in the sense that I never knew a Hester, a Melanie, or an Emma, but I haven't written about that character and given her such a stage 3 times in 3 different novels because obviously I wish I had known someone like that. I wish I had known an Emma or a Hester or a Melanie, but I missed that one.
Okay.
That didn't happen.
I'd like to give the lady over there the opportunity to ask her question as a sort of final question. Okay.
Yeah, you asked me one question, I'll answer 10, so.
Okay. Then yours is the honor to ask the last question. Yes.
40, 50 passes of a sentence, every sentence. You said you take 40 or 50 passes, can you hear me? At a sentence, rewriting in your novels. How do you know when you're done?
Well, I've learned to be very dishonest about that. Because you never want to tell a publisher that you finished a book. You just don't do that. That's a bad idea. Because then they'll start speculating as to when they'll publish it. But when I say I finished a book, maybe that means I've finished a draft of a book. But when I start rewriting it, then I always realize that there's something else I can do that means I haven't finished it. So I often say that I'm almost finished a book when in fact I'm rewriting it, or I'm rewriting it for the 15th or the 16th time. And in the case of this book, as Hans knows, I not only rewrote it all those times in the third-person voice, but in the first-person voice, but then I decided to to rewrite the whole book in the third person, to take it out of the first person narrative and put it into a third person. Well, I've never done that before. That seems to me to be excessively masochistic, even for me. It really, and at the time I said I was going to do this, both my wife and my editor in New York had read the book in the first person and didn't want me to change it. They thought I should see somebody, meaning a doctor or something. They said, for God's sake, it's fine. Why would you dream of changing it? Well, they needed a little convincing. I mean, they just needed to see when I'd rewritten the first chapter a few times. I showed it to them, and then they got it. They saw, oh, I see. It really does make a difference. I said by saying I like to make a lot of distance. I like to not write about things for a long time. When I'm making one of these plans for a novel, it's a way of keeping myself from beginning a book too soon. When I rewrite a book again and again and again, it's just a way of not letting it go, because you don't get another chance. You don't. When I've finished a novel, I don't ever read it again. It's really gone. I don't even look at it again. So I want to be sure that I can't pass through a book before I say it's done enough. It's just, and you have to remember that if you're writing the same story over a 5, 6, 7 year period of time, it's not just that the novel changes over that period of time. You change. Your idea about dialogue and sentences has undergone some alteration. You're no longer using a semicolon the same way you were 7 years ago. You have different feelings about the dash or the parents, right? You change your mind about punctuation over a period of time that's as long as it takes for me to write an average novel. Your views about beginning a sentence with but or beginning a sentence with and. Is it okay? Is it a part of the voice of this story? Or is it not okay? Or do you do it to excess? Those ideas change. If you write something that's 125 pages long and it took you 2 or 3 months to write it, well, your voice stays the same. It doesn't change. It's easy to rewrite something that's that long. But when you're talking almost 2,000 manuscript pages, 7 years, you change the point of view, well, you can't rewrite that story enough. And you see, I think that that's one advantage that I bring to being a writer from having been a wrestler for 20 years and a trainer for 27 more. If you don't love repetition, you can't do any sport well. You just can't, because it's the details are so small, and you have to repeat them so many times. A wrestling match, if it's a close one, might look exciting, but practices and training are not exciting. In addition to the simple butting of heads, there's you have to practice dumb little things so repeatedly that they become second nature. There are so many ways to pick up your opponent's left knee, but there's very few ways that work. And you have to learn how to make your opponent think that
his left knee is the last thing you're interested in. When in fact, if he's good, it's probably the only thing you can do. The only thing you can do is pick up his left knee. It's the only thing you'll ever get. Because you're not fast enough or good enough to get anything else. That's the only thing you're going to score on him with. You got to get his left knee. And guess what? Maybe you've wrestled him 5, 6 times before. He knows you like his left knee. Or even if you haven't wrestled him before, he's seen you on film. He says, there's only one thing this moron can do. He likes your left knee, right? So you have a problem. And the problem is you have to learn 50 ways to make somebody think that you don't care about their left knee. And it's so boring. It's so repetitious. Well, you'll never do it if you don't love that stuff, if you don't love that process. You can't be a writer because you like it when the book jacket for your book is finished. You're a writer because you like the daily process. And you're not tired of the fact that this is the 65th time you've revised this sentence and it still sucks. It's just bad. And you can't ever make it right. And however many times you go back through a book, the same sentence that gave you trouble 7 years ago is going to give you trouble again because there's something you're doing wrong. You're just not getting something about that sentence right. And you can't get, you've got to love it. You've got to say, it's not trivial to change that semicolon to a dash and then back to a semicolon and then back to a dash. It's important somehow. It matters somehow. And no more than you can think. It's not important to make somebody who should know better that you're passionately interested in his right ear when all you really care about is his left knee.
Okay.
But it's repetition. You got to do it. It's musicians know that, right? It's you have to do it.
Yes. Mr. Irving, thank you very much for this evening with you. I would now like to give the microphone back to Corine Krijgsman, director of the John Adams Institute.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Irving, for your entertaining performance, and thank you, Hans, for the interview. I would like to thank also tonight the Bezige Bij publishers for their cooperation. I also would like to thank Saskia Kriekhaus, director of the Anton Philipszaal and the Lucent Dance Theater, for their generous support. And of course, I would like to thank all our volunteers here tonight. For now, I would like to let you know that we're planning some very exciting evenings for fall, but they are not confirmed yet. We are trying to invite Elie Wiesel, Al Gore with his new movie and book Inconvenient True, Jonathan Franzen with The Discomfort Zone, and Tony Judd with his book Post-War. For more information about our lectures or becoming a member, please have a look at our website, or you can go to our information stand. We would really be delighted to welcome you as a member of the John Adams Institute. Because with the support of our members, without the support of our members, we couldn't organize these type of events. Mr. Irving will be signing books here on stage, and maybe you can cue from that side of the stage, and he will only give signatures. If you don't have a copy, they're on sale over there, so please get one. And you're also welcome to have a drink at the bar. Thank you very much.